Hello there and good morning, everybody. Meteorologist Jim Dickey back here in the ABC 7 Hurricane Center with another edition of Tropics Talk. Whole lot to talk about out there in the Atlantic, so let's get right to it. You see three areas to talk about in the Atlantic here today. There's, of course, now Major Hurricane Fiona became the first major hurricane of 2022 overnight. And then two other areas to watch. One in the central Atlantic looks to be on the verge of becoming a tropical depression or tropical storm, actually, but also swirling northward into the North Atlantic. One of those that will likely take a name off the list, but won't really bring much in the way of impacts to anyone whatsoever. And then, complex of thunderstorms sort of jumping off your screen here, just north of the northern coast of South America, working westward toward the Caribbean. That one will spell trouble in all likelihood as we go into the next week or so. Let's begin, though, with Fiona. Here's the 8 o'clock advisory. Remains a Category 3 hurricane with 115 mile per hour sustained winds. Now, it looks like it might be going through what's called an eye wall replacement cycle, meaning basically you get that small inner core at first. It really ramped up in intensity quickly as it pulled away from Hispaniola yesterday. You get that small inner core. A new sort of eye wall begins to form around that smaller core, and as it goes through the transition between those two, the eye will fill and actually usually get a little drop in intensity. So it's at the very least leveled off with its intensification. It's held serve at 115 miles per hour throughout these early morning hours. But the forecast does call for this to further intensify, tracking away from the Turks and Caicos and then headed to the north and east. I think you can see my mouse, but if not, right to the east. Actually, I'll go ahead and zoom in. We can do that. Right to the east of where the Category 4 is, underneath the cone. I don't know if you can make it out. Right there. That's Bermuda. So right on the edge of the cone of concern by the time we get to 2 a.m. Friday. It's important to remember what the cone of concern shows you. So the Hurricane Center goes ahead and makes their forecast for how the center path of the storm is going to track. They fit that cone over it. The cone shows you historic forecast error. History tells you 2/3 of the time the cone will be, or the storm rather, the center will fall within the cone. It could be anywhere then on 2 a.m. on Friday, off here to the west, or perhaps right over Bermuda. Now, most models you look at keep the core to the west of Bermuda, but that places Bermuda on the eastern side of the storm, likely to be lashed with wind and rainfall. All the same would be their second impact now that Earl came through a couple of weeks ago, missing just off, I believe, to the east, missed just to the east. So it's been a busy hurricane season for Bermuda, likely avoiding a direct landfall, though, once again. And then once we get into the weekend, this goes up into the Canadian Maritimes, likely making the transition to a non-tropical low, but will still likely have a big impact there in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia going into, again, the weekend. We're talking the Saturday into Sunday time frame. Note the drop in intensity. That's like the transition to a non-tropical low as it begins to interact with the jet stream. Moving on into the central Atlantic, here's the area of concern the Hurricane Center has highlighted with a high development chance. In fact, you can sort of make out just on this IR satellite imagery the sort of swirling going on the satellite presentation as this tracks its way northward. This, to me, looks like it might already be a tropical depression. Hurricane Center says 80% chance it's a tropical depression or tropical storm in the next 2 days. And you see the track it takes. Could perhaps impact the Azores. Otherwise, no issues from that. And as it tracks northward, the waters cool down. Wind shear is going to pick up. So this is a small window for this to develop and potentially take a name. Next name on the list would be Gaston. After that, Hermine. So likely taking one of those two if it does take a name, but will be short-lived. And a low-impact fish storm. And now we jump just east of the Caribbean. Wide area thunderstorms here. And for some reason, my satellite data isn't updating. You see how the times are scrolling forward. Have to look into that. But yeah, regardless, we do have a complex of thunderstorms here that's not showing much organization at this point in time. And, overnight is when you tend to see these storms flare up with these tropical waves, the diurnal maximum at night, because the water temperatures are still very, very warm, but you're cooling the upper levels of the atmosphere. That sets up an absolutely unstable atmosphere and allows those storms to flourish. So the thing to watch in the near term, the next 24 hours, do these sort of coalesce around one center of circulation? Do we start to get some organization from this, or does this activity collapse a little bit? There is some dry air off to the north, as you can tell, because skies are completely clear off to the north of these storms here. So we'll see if that has any impact. Wind shear does pick up a little bit as it noses towards the islands, but overall, it will have a chance to come together here in the next couple of days. The Hurricane Center says there's a 50-50 shot for development over the next 5 days as this works off to the west. Now, quick rule of thumb in hurricane forecasting and tropical forecasting. This isn't always the case, as most of these sort of quick rules are, but generally speaking, if something doesn't form before it reaches the Caribbean, before it crosses into the eastern side of the Caribbean Sea, it likely will not until it gets to the western end of the Caribbean Sea. Number of reasons for that, especially with this one, it's going to be so close to South America. That's going to be some land interaction there. Further, the inflow disrupted a little bit by Hispaniola, by Puerto Rico, by the higher elevations there. So, again, in the near term, we watch. Does this come together prior to or just as it crosses? Or does it wait and hold off to come together until we get to the western Caribbean Sea? Regardless, there's a whole lot of energy for this thing to work with in the Caribbean, as we almost always see this time of year, late September into early October. This is ocean heat content. So this is really what this would feed off of if it were a proper, already tropical storm or hurricane. Basically jet fuel here in the western end of the Caribbean. Plenty of deep, warm water for something, if it were to form, to be able to strengthen, potentially strengthen rapidly. So, again, we'll be watching this closely as we go forward. Let's go through two models. The first being the GFS, which, as is often the case, the GFS forecast model is pretty aggressive in developing this. In fact, you can see it already closes an isobar, perhaps showing a tropical depression, even a tropical storm, as early as Thursday evening, as it crosses the Lesser Antilles and moves into the eastern end of the Caribbean near Trinidad and Tobago. Continues to work to the west and northwest from there, continues to deepen. We now have by all accounts, a tropical storm, maybe even a hurricane by Sunday morning. And with that stronger storm, it begins to turn north. It's going to feel weakness in the ridge, as we'll talk about in just a bit. By Tuesday morning, it has a hurricane. And over those warmer waters, you can see exactly what happened as that developing storm tracked over where I showed you that deep ocean heat content. It strengthens quickly and would head towards western Cuba from there. Different output being shown by the European forecast model. It keeps this disorganized. There you go, by 10 o'clock on Thursday. There's a little bit of rotation with this, but nothing has closed off. There's not even a closed isobar yet. We go into Sunday. So this is when the GFS already had this as a hurricane near Jamaica. It still has broad, open, low pressure, a broad, swirling low pressure area that continues to slowly meander westward into the western Caribbean Sea. And now something begins to truly coalesce there as it gets away from South America, as it sets up there off to the east of the Yucatan. Yeah, it's quite a difference when you put the two next to each other. I'm showing you those isobars with lines of equal pressure. The GFS has a very deep low pressure area due south of the Keys and Cuba, whereas the European is a little further to the south and west and much, much weaker. Obviously, that will come into play as far as where this goes in the long run. More questions than answers right now, as you expect this far out. So the first thing to see is, where and when does this start to come together? Does it do what the GFS is saying and comes together in the eastern end of the Caribbean even before it moves into the Caribbean Sea, or does it remain weak and disorganized for longer like the European? That will have big implications going down the road. Now, this is a pattern we watch for as we turn over the calendar from September into October. History tells us this area is showing you the most likely formation areas and tracks that storms take. Tells us to watch the western Caribbean Sea, where you often have that deep ocean heat content for storms to form, track into the Gulf, and then we're starting to see those dips in the jet stream, those fronts cut a little further southward, weakens that Atlantic ridge, tends to steer storms to the north and east, and puts Florida at risk. And when you look at the upper level pattern that's setting up, this is definitely one to watch for Florida, for the Gulf Coast. This would be by Tuesday. This is that GFS forecast solution. You've probably heard numerous times, if you watch any type of these videos here, a stronger storm will tend to turn north more quickly. A weaker storm will not be steered as much by those steering factors like that Atlantic ridge. So if the GFS plays out, a stronger storm is going to feel that pull and likely turn northward much more quickly. That brings Florida into play. Perhaps even, and we'll look at this in the ensembles coming up, perhaps even going up over the Bahamas or even east of Florida. You see that ridge backing off to the east because you see that pink over the eastern seaboard? That is a trough of low pressure that cuts in, digs out the ridge, and gives that window of opportunity for this to turn. Now, this is moving a little more slowly. It misses out on that connection to the trough. New high pressure builds in over Florida. That could steer it westward into the Gulf of Mexico as well. Still a question there, which is sort of what the European forecast model is going with. As we look at the ensemble there, shows most of these members tracking this out across the Yucatan and into the central Gulf of Mexico. I'd say it's about a 70-30 split. 70% of the members of the ensemble show this going into the central and western Gulf. About 30% show this turning quickly to the north, going across Cuba and into Florida, and then towards the East Coast. I meant to make a graphic of this. Let me see if I can bring this over to you so you can see it. This is the 6Z GFS version of the ensemble from our friends at Weather Nerds. And it shows a somewhat, different solution. It shows a stronger storm turning more quickly to the north. In fact, it shows only about 30% of the members even in the Gulf at all. It shows the majority going up across Cuba and off the East Coast into the Bahamas, headed off towards the Carolinas. So, bottom line, at this point, there's still a whole lot of uncertainty, as you would expect, again, a week plus out. So the first question to see is, when and where does this come together? As you look at the European, it keeps it weak and disorganized all the way past Jamaica, where, again, the GFS strengthens it more quickly. A weaker storm would tend to go into the Gulf. A stronger storm would tend to turn more quickly northward, bringing the greater Antilles, Florida, perhaps even the Bahamas, into play. Long time to track this one, and that's the good news. Again, the time scale on this is 2 Fridays out from now. This is valid on 9:30, Friday 9:30. So 7 to 10 days still before this comes anywhere close to the United States. So a whole lot of time to track this, to figure out the differences in the models, to home in on that solution. So be sure you're keeping an eye on the forecast. Of course, I'll be keeping you updated frequently on air and online here at ABC 7. So be sure you're tuning in for updates. Until next time, I'm meteorologist Jim Dickey. Have a good day.